Good morning. I wanted to provide some really quick feedback on the this week's discussion, at least the initial post. Obviously, the responses are not due until Sunday, so I don't have much to say about those yet. But I wanted to really quickly, again, give you this feedback that you should consider. Um, That'll help you a little bit with writing your responses. But let's look into it. First of all, let me share my screen. All right. The first thing we want to discuss really quickly, if I can, this idea of the world population problem. And I'm using quotation marks because when you think about it, to say we have a problem, that is more of a subjective term. For example, somebody might say, we have an accidental drowning problem. Somebody, and I'm using this example because I don't know anyone who actually says this, but you could. Someone might say that they think that pools should be regulated. Maybe they might say that we should not have any privately owned pools and that only businesses that have the proper insurance and that jump through the proper hoops and get the proper licenses can have pools, because there are far too many deaths by accidental drownings every year in the United States. And if you look it up, there are deaths every year in the United States from drowning in privately owned pools. So to that person, they would say we have a problem with accidental drownings. And again, my point here is that the term problem is subjective in that way, right? So what might be a problem to one person might not be a problem to another. So keep that in mind. I'm going to use the word problem just because it's the easiest thing to say. But just keep in mind, when I say problem, I don't necessarily mean that it is a problem. It's just the easy way to say it, because whether it's a problem or not, that's up to you to decide whether you think it's a problem or not. That being said, this idea of proactive versus reactive. So some people, you might call them alarmists, and they might say, for sure, we have a problem. We have a huge problem, and we need to take care of it soon. It's going to be the end of the world, right? So even if you don't necessarily subscribe to that, right, the idea that it's a huge problem and it has to be taken care of right away, even if that's not you, even if you're on the other side of the spectrum, you're like, no, this is not a problem at all. You have to understand that eventually, as the population keeps increasing, then yes, eventually it would become what most people might consider a problem, right? So the idea here is, even if you think nothing needs to be done now, or that we shouldn't be restrictive or enact laws or whatever it may be, that's fine. But keep in mind that the idea here, and this is a common theme throughout the semester, is we should consider being proactive versus reactive, meaning even though it's not a problem now, eventually it will be. So let's start planning ahead, right? Anyway, that being said, again, the idea of, do we have a population problem? That brings us to the IPAT equation, which is in your book. But if we look at it, when we're talking about the impact, right, the total impact of humans on Earth, it's not just the population. That's part of the equation, as you can see here. There's the P for population, but it's also affluence and technology, which brings me back to this idea of the USA versus the world as far as population problem is concerned. Generally speaking, for the United States, our growth rate is not, it's below the world average, right? So when you're writing your post, and I don't think many people did this, but you should consider that, right? Because you are writing to your legislator, right? So you should consider the fact that the United States as a whole compared to the world doesn't necessarily have a population problem as far as the number of people we have being born. So that is something to consider. Let me scroll down here. So another thing to consider too is, if you look at this, right, this is the yearly growth rate for the population starting from 1951 to 2019. And this could be tricky. If you just glance at this very quickly and don't give it a second thought, you might say, oh, look at that. The population's going down. But it's not going down, right? We're not saying that. What's happening is the population growth rate is going down. So here we go, right here at 2020, the growth rate was 1.05. That does not mean the population shrunk in 2020. That means it grew by 1.05%. Unlike over here in 1968, it grew by 2.09%. So again, these are just all things to keep in mind. And when you are writing your posts to your senators or representatives, whatever it may be, that would be something to consider, is the fact that the United States does not necessarily have, again, a population problem with our numbers, right? Mostly, if anything, we might have a problem with our affluence and our technology. But again, that's something that's not even addressed in this discussion. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. One solution that I don't think I saw anybody discuss, and I wanted to very quickly bring it up now, is the idea that some countries truly do have a population problem because they are adding a lot more people than what is sustainable. So you could kind of put those two things together. It's like, well, the United States growth rate isn't as high. The growth rate is very high in this third world country. What can we do to help that, if anything, right? So yes, let me go back here to keep my train of thought on the tracks. There we go. Okay, so before I even discuss the discussion, I just wanted to clear all that away, right? Let's talk about this idea of, do we have a problem? So that's been addressed. Now, let's specifically talk about the grading, because many of you, I'm sure, have questions about why you got the grade you did, and you're always welcome to meet me personally, but hopefully this clears things up. A lot of times I'm seeing the same old mistakes that I've already discussed in previous videos. But first of all, make sure you read the prompts carefully. I can see a lot of people just aren't doing all the things that are listed in the prompt. And I'll come back to that specifically about this discussion here in a second. So yeah, read the prompts carefully. Again, make sure, if you have time, read my comments to your classmates before you write your own post. So at the beginning of the week, some people are very good at posting very early. And I went in there and I gave them feedback and I said, hey, make sure you do this, make sure you include that. You don't want to do this, right? All that stuff was there. And I did that a few times. I repeated myself. And at a certain point, I just stopped doing that and then I'll even tell, my next step when I give feedback, after I've given all that feedback, the next thing I'll do is start telling people, like, hey, listen, if you're wondering about the grade you have, go look at the posts I made for the replies I made for your classmate. And I did that for a few times. And then eventually I just even stopped doing that. And I'm just telling you now, before you even post, you should read my comments to your classmates and let those comments, that feedback guide you in writing your own post, right? That's what you should do before your post. But also after your post, if you're wondering what grade or why you got the grade you got, then read the comments I've left for your classmates. Because if you didn't get full credit, or if you didn't get a good grade and I didn't leave feedback, that means I have already left that feedback for somebody, right? In no way would I, or in no circumstance would I give you a lower grade for a unique mistake that I haven't already given feedback for, right? So if you didn't get specific feedback, that means I've already given that feedback a number of times. So yes, read your classmates, read my comments to your classmates. Next, this kind of goes hand in hand. If you can, get it done early. Because if you read my comments to your classmates, you'll see if you get it done early and you make mistakes, usually I'll reply, not just feedback, like, this is what you did wrong, right? It's usually not like that. It's usually like, hey, for additional points, can you reply to this and tell me this? Or can you reply to this and give me that information, right? There are options if you get it done early. Next, correct your mistakes. So this is kind of the opposite of get it done, or not the opposite, but this goes hand in hand with the get it done early part. So if you get it done early and I reply to you and say, hey, can you respond with this information, that information, then do it, right? And then you'll get the extra points and you can correct your mistakes. I spoke with another student earlier, or had an email conversation with a student earlier today. It's never too late to correct your mistakes. So this student, for example, is going to be going back and doing additional responses for last week's discussion. Now, granted, we've already passed last week's discussion, so it won't be for full credit, but it still helps. You can still bump those points up. Moving forward, another common mistake I keep saying every week, you have to use a reference, right? You have to use a reference and you have to make it obvious. And the reference should be something not, from outside of your book, right? So that's 2 points. 2 points if you don't have any reference at all, lost, and then 1 point lost if you have a reference, but you don't say how you used it. So, it's not a game changer if you don't use references, but if you do it every week or don't do it every week, eventually those points add up. So please do that. Also, typos and errors. grammatical errors, spelling errors, typing errors, just saying the wrong thing, something that's not true, those kind of errors. Be careful for those, especially typos. And I'm not an English major, and I'm not very picky with grammar and things like that. But if your post is like 3 sentences long, and each sentence starts with a non-capitalized letter, like how could you not take the time to capitalize those 3 letters, right? I can understand making one mistake if you have like a multi-paragraph post, making one error. But when it's a really short paper and you have many, many errors, you're going to lose points for that. All right, so that's it for the same old mistake. So everything I just said there, that can be applied to every single discussion. These are mistakes I always see, not just for this semester, but every semester. Another specific mistake to this particular discussion is people simply didn't define population growth. And it said it right there in the directions, define population growth. So that's one point if you didn't do that. The next thing, and I've said this before, I don't remember if I said it on the last video, but I at the very least wrote this when I gave early feedback to your classmates. If you were really writing a letter to your senators or your representatives, whatever it may be, you were going to try to convince them. You won't just write and say, hey, I think we have a population problem, and I think you should do this about it, right? You wouldn't do that. You're actually, if whatever issue that you're going to be writing your senator or your representative about, you're going to try to persuade them. So, for example, you would explain why the issue is important to you, whether you think we need to keep the population growth the way it is, or whether you think we need to increase the population growth or decrease the population growth, or if you think the government should be completely hands-off. Whatever the situation may be, you should explain why that is important. And I wrote this, you'll see right here, I have 3, 2, 1. All right. So if you didn't mention it all, like if you said, hey, we have a population problem and just left it at that and didn't say, why is it a problem? Then you lost 3 points, right? At least 3 points if you just didn't even mention it all. Now, if you mentioned it, like said, okay, we have a population problem and left it at that. Excuse me, let me back up. I'm thinking about my next bullet point. I'm moving ahead. Some people didn't even say whether we think we have a problem at all. And again, whether I'm saying that it could be that you think we have a problem as then you think the government's too involved, or you think the government's not involved enough, or whether you think the problem is that we need to increase the population or we need to decrease, whatever the situation may be. Some people just even failed to say that, and very few, but a few people did, in which case you would lose 3 points. Now, almost everybody at least said, hey, we have a population problem, whatever that problem may be. But then they didn't go on to say anything about why it's a problem. They just said, we have a population problem. It's like, well, why is it? And that would be minus 2 points. And then a little bit more common, I think, is that people would at least say, hey, we have a population problem because, and they would give it one example, right? Or a very small number of examples, like, well, we have a population problem because the more people we have, the more resources we use, and it's not sustainable. Okay, well, good. At least you have one sentence. So in that case, you only lost 1 point, right? So the people who got full credit they wrote at least a few sentences, right? Maybe a paragraph devoted to that. Like, here's why it's an issue. Moving forward, same thing with the idea. First of all, some people didn't even propose an idea. All right. So those are the people who lost 3 points. So they may say, hey, we have a population problem, and left it at that. Or we have a population problem and we should do something about it, and left it at that. But what the idea here is you needed to provide some sort of idea of what can be done. So anybody who didn't at least do that lost 3 points. And again, similarly to the above bullet point, if they said, hey, here's what we should do, and then provided maybe like one sentence, here's my idea, this is how it would help, right? In one sentence. At least you mentioned it, but you didn't really go into it. So you lost 2 points. Excuse me. Good grief. I did it again. The people who didn't mention it all lost 3 points. Like didn't say, hey, I have an idea. They lost 3 points. The people who said, hey, I have an idea, here's what we should do, but didn't mention why they think we should do that, then they lost 2 points. And then the people who said, hey, I have an idea, this is what we should do, and maybe had one sentence devoted to this is why it's a good idea, then they lost 1 point. And the people who got full credit said, hey, we have a problem. Here's my idea on how to fix it. Here's why it's a good idea. And they provided quite a few examples, right? Because again, the idea here is you're trying to persuade your elected official. And hopefully this is more than just a thought exercise. Hopefully this is something that you actually do in your real life, even if it's not about population. Hopefully you do write to your elected officials and try to persuade them on some issues. Anyway, that's it for that section. Let me see what's next. Some things I just wanted to point out very quickly, because I see this mistake a lot. We are not talking about population control. You know, a lot of and you didn't lose points if your suggestion did fall under the population control umbrella. You didn't lose points for that, because that umbrella also does fall under the idea of influencing population growth, right? That's what we're talking about, is influencing population growth. But it doesn't have to be population control. It doesn't have to infringe on rights. You know, some people suggested, you know, restricting families to having one child or two children, right? That is infringing on someone's rights. It doesn't have to be that way. It could be something where you provide an incentive to have fewer children. I don't know, like a tax break if you have under X amount of children, as one quick example. Or it could remove the incentive to have more children. For example, right now, the more children you have, the more tax breaks you have. There is an incentive to have as many children as possible. There's also other incentives, but there is an incentive to have children. So what you could do is remove those incentives. And of course, just a big blanket statement, you can make other changes. So generally speaking, when I find people who are passionate about this subject in general, there's usually two sides to it. They either think that we need more government control or less government control. And the thing is, depending on where you stand on that, doesn't necessarily dictate where you stand on whether we should increase or should influence population control or not. Because, for example, if you're the kind of person who thinks the government needs to be less involved in our lives, then in some ways we could make some get the government out of our lives changes, but also still influence the population growth. For example, and this is really wacky, but I'm just throwing it out there as an example. If you were to get rid of seatbelt laws, right? You know, for adults, obviously, I think it would be prudent to have children make sure they're using seatbelts. But you could say, yeah, it is now legal for all adults to not wear seatbelts if they want, or not wear helmets. Or if you've got beef with your neighbor and you both agree to it, then you're allowed to have a duel, right? Or in a lot of places, suicide is illegal. So all these things we could do to get rid of government influence, government restrictions, right? You could remove restrictions and still somehow influence the population growth. Not that I'm saying we should do that. I'm just using that as an example, because very often people, when they read this prompt, they start thinking, no, we already have too much government influence. Well, that's just something to consider. And another big thing on a related note, this is not about reducing the human population. I'm hoping people are using typos when they write that. We're not talking about killing people, right? That's not even up for debate. That was not part of the discussion. Let's talk about population growth, right? So we're talking about maybe reducing the amount of children that people have, or increasing the amount of children people have, whichever your stance may be. But anyway, that's it. If you got through all this, send me an email. Let me know you saw it. Send me in the email, include a few sentences that indicate that you watched the whole thing, right? Convince me. And then I'll give you 1 point of extra credit. And if you specifically want feedback on your discussion, so we can look at yours, let me know. We can meet online. If we do that, you'll get a 5% boost to your grade. If you let me record it and then I can share that with your classmates, then that will be a 10% boost to the grade. So that's it. That's all I have. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video.